Hey, friends! I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The morning began with a fragile calm, a deceptive serenity that masked the tension simmering beneath the surface. She remembered the way they had laughed together just hours before, the ease of conversation, the shared understanding that had once made everything feel simple and unshakable. It had taken only a minor disagreement, a momentary clash over something trivial, for the first fissures to appear. She traced the incident in her mind, recalling how words that were meant to clarify instead inflamed, how the slightest shift in tone and inflection could escalate a disagreement far beyond its original scope. The argument had been small, almost laughable in its origin, yet it contained within it the perfect conditions for growth: pride, defensiveness, and unspoken expectations that neither had voiced but both assumed. Each participant had approached the moment with their own internal narrative, a mixture of past grievances, insecurities, and assumptions about the other's intentions, creating a combustible combination that turned a minor disagreement into a seed of division. She remembered the instant she chose to insist on her perspective, feeling a surge of righteousness that, in retrospect, had been nothing more than ego asserting itself over empathy. She had believed that standing her ground would establish clarity and respect, failing to recognize that communication requires timing, tone, and the willingness to bend in order to preserve connection. As the day progressed, she noticed the subtle ways in which the energy between them shifted. Small gestures that had once carried warmth became measured and cautious. Glances and movements that previously communicated ease now hinted at tension. The room itself seemed to take on a different quality, charged with unspoken frustrations, a quiet reminder of the argument that had erupted and grown unchecked. She reflected on the nature of conflict, realizing that the escalation had been less about the initial disagreement and more about how it had been handled: the missed opportunities for empathy, the failure to pause and consider the other's perspective, and the way pride had overshadowed connection. Her mind wandered to the subtle patterns that had emerged in their interactions prior to the argument, moments where minor irritations had been dismissed or brushed aside, accumulating silently until they provided fuel for a larger confrontation. She recognized that small arguments often carry hidden significance, signaling deeper needs, insecurities, and unresolved tensions that, if left unaddressed, can grow disproportionately. Her thoughts shifted to the emotional landscape within herself, the mingling of frustration, hurt, and the desire to assert control, the tension between wanting to be right and wanting to be understood, and the simultaneous fear of appearing weak or vulnerable. Each of these internal currents influenced her words and actions, shaping the argument's trajectory in ways she could not fully control or predict. She also considered his experience, imagining the ripple of perception and emotion that her words had created, the possibility that he, too, was navigating a complex mix of pride, hurt, and longing for resolution. The interplay of internal states between them highlighted how delicate communication can be, how quickly misunderstandings can magnify, and how even minor misalignments in perception or expectation can produce disproportionate consequences. As the day wore on, she noticed the first signs of withdrawal: pauses in conversation, the subtle tightening of facial expressions, the slight hesitation before responding. These cues, initially small, indicated the expansion of the gap, the silent growth of a division that neither had intended but that both now reinforced with every unspoken thought and withheld gesture. She reflected on the irony that a disagreement born of triviality could wield such power, reshaping the emotional terrain they had once navigated with ease and familiarity. The argument had illuminated vulnerabilities, revealing how pride and defensiveness could override the desire for connection, how assumptions and unspoken expectations could dictate responses, and how quickly proximity could feel charged with distance. By the evening, the emotional climate had shifted completely. The initial spark had become a quiet, persistent tension, a thread of separation weaving itself between them, invisible yet palpable. She felt the weight of what had been lost in a single day, the intimacy that had been taken for granted now strained by miscommunication, unresolved emotions, and the unchecked growth of a small argument. Reflection deepened, leading her to consider the long-term patterns that had allowed such escalation, moments of dismissal, fleeting irritations, and the failure to address underlying feelings with openness and vulnerability. Each observation underscored the fragile balance of relationships, the delicate interdependence of words, gestures, and timing that sustain connection, and the ease with which small disruptions can spiral into profound distance. As night fell, she was left with a vivid awareness of the argument's consequences, the subtle shifts in emotion and behavior, and the realization that the gap between them had begun to widen in ways that required conscious attention, humility, and effort to repair. In that moment, the chapter closed with the quiet acknowledgement that relationships are living systems, shaped not only by grand gestures but by the accumulation of small interactions, and that even minor conflicts, left unattended, can expand beyond imagination, creating ripples that alter closeness, trust, and daily life in lasting ways. In the days following the initial spark, the small argument began to grow in ways she had not anticipated, evolving from a fleeting clash of words into a pervasive tension that shaped every interaction. Each moment of silence between them seemed heavier than the last, an accumulation of unspoken resentment and unresolved emotion that widened the gap with imperceptible precision. She found herself replaying the disagreement repeatedly, analyzing every word, tone, and gesture, searching for the precise moment where things had shifted from triviality to fracture. Her mind oscillated between justification and regret, trying to rationalize her initial defensiveness while simultaneously acknowledging the subtle ways her pride had prevented de-escalation. She noticed the effects of this emotional distance in mundane routines. Shared spaces that once felt warm and familiar now carried a stiffness. Casual gestures of affection became cautious or absent, and even ordinary conversation was tinged with a hesitant formality, a reminder that the emotional current between them had been disrupted. The absence of dialogue allowed assumptions and projections to flourish, each person filling the silence with imagined intentions, grievances, or slights, amplifying the separation without ever speaking the truths that could bridge it. She reflected on how small misunderstandings, left unchecked, can snowball, feeding on the natural human tendencies toward pride, defensiveness, and the fear of vulnerability. Each day seemed to bring a subtle increase in distance, measured not in grand actions but in micro moments, a glance withheld, a pause before responding, a laughter that felt a fraction less genuine. The weight of these minor interactions, accumulating over time, produced a sense of emotional gravity that pulled her toward introspection. She examined her own role in the escalation, recognizing patterns of reaction and internal dialogue that had contributed to the widening gap. Pride had dictated her responses, framing compromise as weakness and fueling a stubborn adherence to being right rather than seeking understanding. At the same time, she became aware of the psychological complexity of distance, how absence, silence, and lack of feedback create fertile ground for anxiety, self-reproach, and the magnification of perceived slights. Observing him from afar, even in shared spaces, she could sense the tension he carried, a mirrored reflection of her own internal conflict, and she realized that the emotional distance was mutual, each feeding off the other's withdrawal. The once simple rhythm of their relationship had become intricate and fragile, and every interaction carried a subtle risk of further widening the chasm. She began to consider the relational mechanics at play, how trust, emotional reciprocity, and the willingness to engage in vulnerability are constantly negotiated, and how easily they can be disrupted by even minor conflicts that remain unresolved. Reflection became both analytical and emotional. She considered alternative approaches she might have taken during the argument, moments where a pause, a softened tone, or an acknowledgement of his perspective could have prevented escalation. She recognized that conflict, even small conflict, carries exponential potential to influence emotional climates, relational stability, and patterns of engagement. Each day without dialogue became both a source of regret and a learning space, highlighting the importance of timing, communication, and intentionality in maintaining connection. She observed the interplay of anticipation and avoidance, recognizing that her hesitancy to initiate reconciliation, born of fear of rejection or further confrontation, only allowed the tension to embed more deeply. This avoidance, while seemingly protective, magnified the emotional weight of the separation, reinforcing cycles of self-doubt, longing, and frustration. The more she analyzed the sequence of events, the clearer it became that the argument had served as a catalyst, revealing vulnerabilities in both her emotional management and the dynamics of the relationship itself. She realized that the escalation was not merely about the initial disagreement, but about the cumulative effect of avoidance, unspoken grievances, and the failure to address emotions as they arose. Observing the subtle changes in his behavior, his tone, gestures, and expressions provided insight into the impact of the growing silence. Each small withdrawal, each tentative adjustment in his engagement reinforced the reality that the argument had shifted the equilibrium, introducing friction and uncertainty into a space that had once been fluid and familiar. Emotionally, she experienced a constant oscillation, waves of longing, bursts of irritation at her own inability to repair the damage, moments of clarity tempered by guilt and reflection. She began to understand that relational repair requires both acknowledgement of missteps and the courage to bridge silence. Yet she also recognized the fear embedded in vulnerability, the risk that reaching out could be met with resistance, misunderstanding, or dismissal. By the end of the chapter, the small argument had grown into a pervasive presence, shaping daily interactions, internal reflection, and the emotional landscape of their connection. She understood that the rift was both self-created and mutual, a product of unaddressed feelings, subtle withdrawals, and the unchecked accumulation of pride and defensiveness. The chapter closed with the awareness that the path forward would require deliberate attention, emotional courage, and a willingness to confront both the argument itself and the patterns that allowed it to expand, highlighting the fragile yet resilient nature of human connection and the profound impact of even minor conflicts when left unresolved. As the days stretched into weeks, the silence that followed the initial argument deepened into a tangible presence, a constant reminder of both what had been lost and the subtle power of unresolved conflict. She felt the weight of each unspoken word pressing on her chest, the absence of conversation amplifying every fleeting thought of him, turning minor memories into poignant markers of longing. Each morning began with a mixture of hope and apprehension, a quiet anticipation that perhaps today would be different, that she might hear from him, that a bridge could be rebuilt with a single gesture, a single acknowledgement. Yet each day ended with the same quiet void. She observed her own patterns with acute self-awareness, noting how every small action, hesitation to call, delay in messaging, overthinking a possible interaction served only to widen the chasm. The mind, unoccupied by dialogue, became a fertile ground for reflection, imagination, and the magnification of perceived errors. She traced back the moments that had led here, recognizing how minor miscommunications and unchecked pride had compounded into this present reality. Every glance, every tone, every small gesture from him that once carried warmth now seemed laden with distance, even if he had not intentionally conveyed it. She considered the emotional mechanisms at play, how pride and fear of vulnerability had prevented reconciliation, how the human tendency to avoid discomfort allowed a small spark of disagreement to ignite a long-lasting fissure. Her thoughts often circled back to what could have been said differently, how her words or reactions might have been tempered with empathy, patience, or compromise. In the quiet of her reflection, she began to understand the power of accumulation, how tiny actions, tiny misjudgments, and tiny hesitations can build invisible walls that eventually feel insurmountable. Every day she experienced the subtle erosion of closeness, noticing the nuanced ways in which absence can transform a relationship. Even shared spaces, routines, and mutual friends became reminders of what had been lost, each encounter tinged with a quiet melancholy born of distance. Emotionally, she oscillated between yearning and frustration, between hope for repair and the sting of stubbornness that had prevented it. She felt the weight of missed opportunities for connection, the regret of not bridging the gap when it was still small enough to navigate. Her internal dialogue became a rigorous analysis of cause and effect, how her defensiveness, reluctance to yield, and unspoken assumptions had contributed to the widening of the divide, and how each missed chance for communication reinforced both distance and emotional tension. Observing him from afar, even indirectly, she could sense the subtle adjustments in his behavior, the careful negotiation of space, the ways in which he responded to absence with his own set of interpretations and emotions. She realized that the silence was not a void but a dynamic force, shaping both their perceptions and emotional realities. Each day without dialogue reinforced patterns that were increasingly difficult to break, teaching her the critical importance of timely engagement, vulnerability, and the willingness to address conflict before it metastasizes. She reflected on relational dynamics, noting that connection is maintained through continuous micro-interactions, attentiveness, and responsiveness, and that even small lapses can have cascading effects. The chapter also explored her growing self-awareness, recognizing triggers, understanding her own emotional reactivity, and learning to differentiate between pride and principle, fear and insight. She observed how her longing was intertwined with self-reproach, each memory of him carrying both affection and the ache of regret, each reflection on the argument a lesson in the delicate balance of communication and ego. The passage of time heightened her perception of loss, emphasizing that absence, when layered with unresolved tension, can shift the emotional landscape profoundly, influencing behavior, thought patterns, and relational potential. By the end of the chapter, she had developed a deep recognition of the cumulative power of silence, the exponential effect of small, unaddressed conflicts, and the ways in which avoidance magnifies separation. She understood that the growing distance was not merely external but internal as well, shaping perception, emotion, and readiness for reconciliation. The chapter closed with an acute awareness that bridging this divide would require both courage and insight, the willingness to confront personal responsibility, the understanding of relational dynamics, and the deliberate cultivation of communication and empathy to transform absence back into connection. As the silence continued to stretch between them, she became increasingly aware of the subtle ways in which absence reshaped perception and emotion. The days felt heavier, marked by the quiet awareness of his presence in her life despite the lack of interaction. She noticed how memories of ordinary moments, the way he laughed, the slight gestures of care, the familiarity of shared routines carried an intensified weight, becoming reminders of what had been lost to the unspoken tension. Each recollection was both a comfort and a source of ache, highlighting the disparity between the closeness they once shared and the current gulf of detachment. She began to observe the nuanced patterns in her own behavior, the careful pacing of her actions to avoid confrontation, the self-imposed limits on communication, and the constant mental review of what might have gone wrong. This heightened self-awareness was accompanied by a restless longing, a quiet but insistent pull toward him, even as pride and fear restrained her from initiating contact. She recognized the duality of her internal experience and intense desire to reach out combined with the apprehension of rejection or exacerbation of the rift. The argument that had begun as trivial had grown into a complex emotional landscape, revealing vulnerabilities and tendencies she had not fully acknowledged before. Her reflections extended to the ways in which both she and he might be navigating this tension, each interpreting silence through the lens of personal emotion and cognitive bias, each assuming the other's intentions in the absence of dialogue. She realized that silence is not simply the absence of words but a dynamic force capable of reshaping connections, altering perception, and deepening emotional distance. She observed how even small gestures and shared spaces, his attention to routines, his presence in moments once intimate now carried a different significance, often amplified by the absence of communication. Each day without resolution reinforced the gap, embedding subtle but persistent patterns of caution, hesitation, and emotional guardedness. Internally, she grappled with a mixture of regret, longing, and frustration, recognizing that the escalation from a minor disagreement to prolonged silence had been influenced by pride, defensiveness, and the failure to address emotions proactively. She reflected on the importance of timing and relational repair, understanding that early intervention, acknowledgement, and empathy might have prevented the widening of the divide. Her awareness of this dynamic prompted a series of internal experiments, imagining scenarios of apology, recalibration of tone, and tentative attempts at re-establishing connection, even if only in thought. Each mental rehearsal highlighted both the potential for reconciliation and the risks inherent in delayed action. She also considered the relational mechanics underlying their separation, how patterns of avoidance, unspoken expectations, and emotional withdrawal interact to reinforce distance, how subtle misalignments in perception can escalate conflict, and how recognition of these patterns is critical to reversing the trajectory. Emotionally, she experienced waves of contrasting sensations: sorrow for the current state of estrangement, nostalgia for the intimacy that had been taken for granted, and determination to understand her own contributions to the conflict. She became increasingly attuned to the interplay between emotional response and behavioral choice, recognizing that every hesitation or inaction, though seemingly minor, contributed to the persistence of the rift. Observation of his continued presence, even in shared or indirect contexts, underscored the tangible impact of the argument and its lingering consequences. She noted the ways in which absence shapes memory, perception, and longing, amplifying both affection and regret. By the end of the chapter, she had developed a deeper appreciation for the cumulative effects of minor conflicts left unresolved, the subtle power of silence to reshape relationships, and the necessity of intentional, courageous action to address emotional distance. The chapter closed with an awareness that repair would require both insight and deliberate effort, that bridging the gap was contingent on acknowledging responsibility, understanding relational dynamics, and cultivating empathy, patience, and communication to transform the accumulated tension into a path toward renewed connection. As time stretched onward, her awareness of the argument's lingering effects deepened, and she began to confront the emotional and cognitive consequences of allowing a minor disagreement to expand unchecked. Each day was infused with a quiet tension, a persistent undercurrent of longing and regret that colored every thought and interaction. She reflected on the subtle ways in which pride and defensiveness had dictated her behavior during the initial spark, understanding now that her insistence on being right had been a mask for fear of vulnerability and loss of control. This realization brought with it a mixture of shame and insight, compelling her to examine not only her actions but the underlying motivations that had shaped them. The absence of conversation had created space for reflection but also for emotional distortion, where imagined slights and projected intentions magnified the perceived magnitude of the conflict. She noticed how small, habitual behaviors, hesitations in speaking, cautious gestures, and tentative social interactions were influenced by the unresolved tension, subtly altering her demeanor and the way she navigated shared spaces. Observation became a critical tool for understanding the dynamics at play, both within herself and in relation to him. She considered how he might be experiencing the separation, imagining the thoughts and emotions that accompanied his silence, recognizing that the distance was mutual and reinforced by each of their individual responses. This perspective cultivated a nuanced understanding of relational reciprocity, the way actions and inactions interact to shape emotional climates, and the importance of acknowledging one's role in sustaining conflict. She began to experiment mentally with potential strategies for repair, envisioning ways to bridge the gap, initiate communication, and restore a sense of connection. Each imagined scenario highlighted both possibilities and risks, illustrating the delicate balance required to approach reconciliation thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Reflection on these strategies illuminated broader lessons about the nature of relationships, the fragility of trust, the compounding effect of small missteps, and the critical importance of timely, empathetic engagement. Emotionally, she navigated waves of regret and longing, each moment infused with the dual awareness of her responsibility and the persistent desire to reconnect. She recognized that processing these emotions required both honesty and self-compassion, an acknowledgement of past mistakes without allowing them to immobilize or define her. Cognitive clarity emerged as she began to differentiate between the narrative constructed by pride and the reality of the relational situation. She could see the specific choices, both large and small, that had contributed to the growing separation, and she identified patterns in her own behavior, tendencies toward defensiveness, avoidance, and overanalysis that had amplified the conflict. This awareness prompted the development of adaptive strategies, intentional reflection before action, measured communication, and deliberate attention to tone, timing, and empathy in all interactions. She also began to explore the emotional consequences of sustained absence, noticing how longing, nostalgia, and the amplified perception of loss informed her daily thoughts and interactions with others. The intensity of missing him became both a motivator and a teacher, revealing the ways in which unaddressed emotional currents can shape behavior, perception, and relational potential. Observing the ripple effects of the argument, she saw how even minor conflicts, when left unresolved, can evolve into long-term emotional patterns that influence future communication, trust, and intimacy. She considered how the interplay of pride, fear, and inaction had allowed a small spark to expand into a chasm, understanding the necessity of conscious intervention to reverse the trajectory. By the close of the chapter, she had cultivated a deeper comprehension of relational dynamics, the importance of accountability, and the mechanisms through which minor disagreements can escalate and persist. She recognized that repair required deliberate courage, strategic thought, and emotional intelligence, and that the process of rebuilding connection would demand both insight into her own contributions and an awareness of the subtle interplay of emotions, assumptions, and unspoken tensions. The chapter concluded with the awareness that personal growth, relational repair, and the restoration of trust are iterative processes dependent on reflection, intentionality, and the willingness to confront discomfort, embrace vulnerability, and actively cultivate communication that bridges the distance created by prolonged silence. By the time the sixth chapter unfolded, the weight of absence and the consequences of the argument had settled into her daily consciousness, shaping both her internal world and the dynamics of their shared history. She felt the enduring presence of the silence between them, an invisible yet palpable barrier that influenced every thought, every memory, and every fleeting anticipation of contact. The days without dialogue had deepened her awareness of how fragile communication can be, how quickly pride, defensiveness, and hesitation can transform a minor dispute into a lingering chasm. She examined her own emotional landscape with heightened clarity, noting how longing, regret, and self-reproach had intertwined to create a persistent undercurrent that influenced behavior and perception. Each memory of him, his expressions, gestures, and the familiar cadence of his voice carried amplified significance, a mixture of comfort, loss, and unfulfilled expectation. She reflected on the mechanisms by which a small disagreement had escalated, tracing the interplay of ego, fear of vulnerability, and avoidance that allowed the conflict to grow unchecked. These insights revealed patterns she had previously overlooked, illuminating how minor missteps, when combined with silence and unspoken assumptions, can accumulate into consequences far beyond their origin. Observing the subtle traces of his behavior from a distance, she discerned the same dynamic mirrored in his actions: careful withdrawals, measured responses, and an invisible negotiation of distance that reinforced the separation. She recognized the duality of this experience, the emotional weight of longing and regret on her side, mirrored by the quiet persistence of tension on his. Each day became a study in relational dynamics, a meditation on how patterns of interaction, avoidance, and miscommunication shape connection over time. She explored the interplay of responsibility and circumstance, understanding that while pride and defensiveness had contributed to the widening gap, the passage of time and unspoken assumptions had also played a role, allowing the argument to harden into sustained distance. Her reflections extended to the broader implications for personal growth and relational intelligence. She saw that understanding the impact of minor conflicts, managing emotional responses, and cultivating humility and empathy are critical for maintaining and restoring connection. The chapter examined the integration of these lessons into conscious strategy, how deliberate reflection, awareness of cognitive biases, and intentional actions can repair relational rifts and prevent future escalation. Emotionally, she navigated a complex landscape of sorrow, longing, and cautious hope, acknowledging the enduring effect of absence while considering pathways toward reconciliation. She recognized that repair would require courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to confront both her own role and the residual tension that had accumulated over time. Observing her own thought patterns, she identified recurring cycles of self-blame, overanalysis, and hesitation, noting how these tendencies had reinforced emotional distance and delayed attempts at resolution. By addressing these internal dynamics, she cultivated a more strategic and reflective approach, balancing self-awareness with proactive engagement. The chapter also emphasized the temporal dimension of relational repair, illustrating how patience, timing, and careful attention to emotional cues are essential when navigating complex dynamics. She understood that resolution is rarely instantaneous, requiring sustained effort, thoughtful communication, and an ongoing commitment to understanding both one's own and the other's experience. As she reflected on the broader journey from a minor argument to sustained silence, she gained insight into the fragile nature of human connection, the exponential impact of small conflicts, and the importance of attentiveness, empathy, and humility in maintaining relational equilibrium. By the end of the chapter, she had achieved a nuanced awareness of the interplay between action, inaction, and consequence, recognizing that growth and reconciliation depend on integrating reflection, emotional intelligence, and deliberate effort. The narrative concluded with the recognition that while the path forward may be uncertain, the lessons gleaned from absence, reflection, and introspection provide a foundation for future connection, resilience, and the capacity to navigate conflict with both insight and compassion.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.